So I can see you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sutherland. That was very beautiful, very, very moving. Mr. McCoy and Mr. Buchanan mentioned earlier how many feast sites, feasts that they've attended. This year, this will be my 45th Feast of Tabernacles. I would like to point out, even though I should not have to, though, that I am much younger than Mr. McCoy and Mr. Buchanan. I was about 6 months old when my family started attending the Church of God. 6 months, I often say I had a lot to repent of before attending, but many feasts. And so I started there, taking a nap on the floor, transitioned to playing with toys on the floor. I loved the opportunity, new toys to play with each feast, gifts from my parents. And then that turned into being a teenager, attending the feast. And I've been there, excited to go to a feast and go to services, hoping that I'd be sitting next to that sweet young thing I was hoping to be sitting next to. Starting to pay attention to what was being said during the sermons. And we would hear exhortation that God's anointed would help usher in the kingdom of God. And I didn't know how to take that as a young person. How am I going to do that? What talents do I have? How capable am I? What qualifies me to be a king or a priest? And to tell you the truth, it's a question that hasn't gone away as now I've gotten older and experienced many more years. What qualifies me to be a king? What qualifies you to be a priest? What characteristics is God looking for from those entering his kingdom? Now, it might be a bit presumptuous for me to do this, but I would like to propose that there are two main characteristics that God is looking for. Why just two when there are so many talents? There's talents of leadership. There's talents of preaching. There's talents of what we just heard, music. Talents of administration, problem solving, engineering. So many talents. Why just two? And you can't turn to the scriptures and say, these two are it. But I would hold out that the preponderance of the evidence suggests that these two are a summary of what we need. And I would also hold out that these two are what we should be working on today. So what are these two characteristics? What two are so vital for us to have? Well, before I tell you the two, let's review why it's so important. Let's start by turning back to Isaiah chapter 59. Let's review the condition of the world when our older brother returns. Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 1. The condition of the world at Christ's return is going to be one of utter rebellion. Rebellion against God and his ways will reach a fever pitch. Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 1. Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it cannot save, nor is his ear so dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he does not hear. For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken falsehood. Your tongue mutters wickedness. As we know and preach and teach in the Church of God, man has been given our own way, to try it our way. God says, okay, starting with Adam and Eve, this is a decision you make. Let's see how it turns out. Let's see how your way works. And as we just read, our iniquities, our ways of mankind separate us from God. And we see the results around us in the world today. We see broken families. We see utter disregard for authority figures. We see a blaspheming of God's word, a twisting and turning, a complete rebellion against God's way. Let's look back in Revelation chapter 11. And when you think it cannot get worse, somehow Satan finds a way to make it worse. I was not to go to school. Christ is going to return because things have gotten so bad back in the end of the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s. But time has gone on, and we've seen things have gotten much worse. Revelation chapter 11. And we see here another example of the state of the world and the attitude towards God and his representatives. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 1. Then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, "Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Leave out of the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." These 2 are now representing God. And for the sake of time, I'll summarize the next few verses. These 2 represent, with great miracles and testimony of God's return. But if we skip down to verse 9, in verse 8, verse 7, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom in Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Those from the people and tribes and tongues and nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days and will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate. Things will have gotten so bad, and the rebellion against God and his ways will have gotten so bad that the entire world will celebrate at the death of God's representatives. Let's also look at Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1. Revelation 17 and verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came out and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality. And those who dwell on the earth will be made drunk with the wine of her immorality." Verse 3, and he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and he saw a woman sitting on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 7 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and the unclean things of her immorality. Skipping down to verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received the kingdom, but they receive authority as the kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they gave their power and authority to the beast. Verse 14, these will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. So Once again, we read here the rebellion that is going to be against God's way, against God, against God's people. The rebellion will be at a fever pitch. Based upon mankind's rebellion led by Satan, it stresses the importance of us having these two characteristics, as it will definitely be a unique time. What's so special about these two characteristics? What is so important? What is so vital that we understand them? We think about them. We dwell on them. We make them core to what type of Christian we are becoming. These two characteristics are very important for us. But before I tell you what these two characteristics are, let's continue to review what the world's going to be like. At Christ's return, the earth will be in need of healing and education. Turn to Matthew 24. We will read about a time that will have not been seen on the face of the earth. And that's hard to imagine with the atrocities that we've seen through last century and even this century. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 21. Matthew 24 and 21, verse 21. But then there was a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Dropping down to verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. It will get so bad, worse than we've seen. Revelation chapter 21. Revelation 8. Revelation chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8 and verse 1. We read about the seventh seal, which is the seven trumpets. And when the Lamb broke the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. Another angel came and stood at the altar, holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, so that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar which was before the throne. And in the smoke and in the incense and the prayers of the saints went up before God in the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and threw it on the earth. And there followed peals of thunder and sounds of flashes of lightning and an earthquake. And the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound them. The first sounded, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. Now as we read through these trumpets, put yourself in that situation. Imagine what it would be like that you've never read the book of Revelation. You don't understand what it means. And suddenly these things start happening to you. There came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up. A third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood. Imagine sitting overlooking the Atlantic Ocean after the hail, then everywhere you can see, it's blood red. And a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. I like this feast site because it is on the ocean, but it has a nice breeze. You've been to some places on the beach, on the ocean, where there's a tendency for like dead marine life to wash ashore. You walk along the beach, you almost have to hold your nose. Can you imagine a third of the animals dying and washing up on shore? With it coming disease. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from the heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell in a third of the rivers and the springs of water. The name of the star is called wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, became bitter. So not only can you not drink it, but if you drink it, it would kill you. It's like if you're stranded out in the ocean, you become so thirsty, the only thing you have is salt water. But if you drink salt water, it kills you, makes you crazy, and then it kills you. And it's the same situation. No one will have fresh water to drink. The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars were struck, so that a third of them would be darkened, and the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet and of the three angels who are about to sound." So if this isn't bad enough, then I'm going to say, you haven't seen anything yet. And then the three final angels come and are sounded, bringing it with the armies to destroy. So if you can imagine what it's going to be like as a human if you survive, what type of condition, what type of shape would you be in? It's hard to imagine what this will be like, and we have some examples, unfortunately, to look through. On the way out, my family and I had the opportunity to stop at the National Holocaust Museum. It is a very moving exhibit. What the Jews and the political enemies of the Third Reich had to endure under their persecution. What was really eye-opening about the story and what they conveyed is not only, about everyone's familiar with the trials and the tribulations and the death that these people went through, but what was eye-opening to me was the continued struggles of those after they had been liberated. Many thousands continued to die on a daily basis after the liberation. I always thought they were freed, the gates were open, they were given food and water. But these prisoners, these victims were in such a shape that getting food and water was not enough. They were in such bad shape that they continued to die. Or their systems were not prepared for the food and water that they were given, or the diseases that they were continuing to carry would take their lives. It wasn't at that day of liberation that they were free, but many continued to suffer, and many continued to need help. And it was not only physical, but many who survived the Holocaust and those who saw the results continued to question the presence of God. They were spiritually harmed. One well-known professor, a Jewish professor, Richard Rubenstein, wrote a book, an original piece on this issue called After Auschwitz. And he held that only the intellectually honest response to the Holocaust is to reject God and to recognize that all existence is ultimately meaningless. There is no divine plan or purpose, no God that reveals his will to mankind, and God does not care about the world. Man must assert and create his own value in life. And that was one example of the response after seeing what they saw and witnessing and experiencing it, it's a question of how can there be such a God? So if you can imagine the people that would survive the Great Tribulation after hearing so much about where all just came from stuff in the ocean that happened to come together at the right time in the right way for us to be walking on the face of the earth. There can be no God if this is what we've seen, because they do not understand the plan of salvation. They do not understand Satan and his role. They will be in such a physical and emotional and spiritual state that they're going to need a tremendous amount of help. So what are these two characteristics? These two characteristics, I believe, are so vital. They're so vital that I've decided to make them as part of my title. And the title of my sermon is an important way to communicate what I intend to say. And before I provide my title, let's also review our purpose in this. God has called us to serve. We are called for a purpose. We are not called to save our own skins. We are not called just to avoid the tribulation. It's interesting that whenever there's occurrences in the world, our attendance has a tendency to spike. Because people remember, oh yeah, something may be coming, and I don't want to be a part of that, so I better get to church. Or we want to be able to put changes or allow changes to our physical ailing bodies and to become one of spirit. Many of us are aching, and we look forward to that day to become turned into a spirit being. But that is not our purpose. That's not the purpose for our calling. That is not why God opened your eyes and our minds. Yes, those things will happen. But it is not why we are called. Let's look at Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3. Revelation 3 and verse 21. He who overcomes, I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father in his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So those who overcome will be offered a chance to sit with God on his throne, to be a part. But is that it? Is that the purpose? This will happen. But let's also look at Revelation chapter 20 and verse 6. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 6. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. We will be priests of God. We are called to minister. We are called to be priests. God has created a special people that he calls his priesthood, and also called a kingdom of priests. That is why we are called. And what makes us so special? Obviously, we know it's nothing of our own capabilities, nothing of our own doing. It's God's calling, it's God's knowledge that sets us apart, that makes us unique. We can't make anything holy of them by ourselves. Only God can make things holy. Only God can make things special. And for whatever reason, that's a question I would love to ask. Why? Why us? Why not them? What was the selection process? Of course, being physical, we don't understand the mind of God, but I'm looking forward to hearing and understanding. But there's nothing special enough by ourselves. But through his plan of salvation, we know that God is calling some first fruits at this time that will help usher in his kingdom. A priesthood that would teach the way. What are these two characteristics? These two characteristics are a heart of obedience and a heart of service, which is also my title, if you like titles. If you don't like titles, it's my title anyway. A heart of obedience and a heart of service. I would hold out that these two characteristics, which we need to be working on now, are critical for us being a kingdom of priests, being part of the royal priesthood that will help usher in the kingdom of God, that will be there to work on those things that we just reviewed. But let's dig into them a bit deeper. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 29. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 29. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 29. Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all of my commandments, always, that it may be well with them, with their sons forever. God needs to know that we will respect his authority. When it comes to a heart of obedience, he wants to know, will we keep his commandments? Will we fear him? And it is not a response of fear, of just a fear of saying, well, if I don't do this, I know I'm going to be spanked. But it's also an understanding that it may be well with them and their sons forever. The nation of Israel was to be a model nation. They were given the commandments and statutes and the way. Why? So they could be an example. Not so that the neighboring nations would say, look how horrible it is for them. They can't play basketball on Friday night. They can't eat that nicely sliced ham that's so good and so tasty. How horrible for them. No, we read in Deuteronomy that they were an example so that the surrounding nations can go, so their God is with them. They are blessed. That's what God's way does. That's what obedience does. It blesses us individually, and blesses us as a group, as a family, as a community. Let's look at James chapter 4. This question of obedience is core to a Christian life. James chapter 4. In the beginning, James is talking about problems that were happening, the beginning of the chapter, I should say. James is talking about problems that were occurring in the congregation. Why there were problems, why there were issues. And he asks in verse 1, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? And he goes through and talks about some of them. But his resolution then is in verse 7. Therefore, submit to God. Be obedient to God. Be obedient to God in his ways. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Our Creator has demonstrated through recorded time that through all of his interaction with mankind, whether it be personal, as a one-to-one relationship, you start with God's relationship with Adam and Eve. You can look at Abram, then Abraham, You can look at a group of people, obviously like the nation of Israel, or even us today, under the new covenant, that through all of his interaction, no matter what the circumstances, that God is looking for those that will submit to him, that will submit to his way. Not because he's looking for mindless slaves. He's not looking for lemmings and robotons. He's looking for those that are willing to submit to him in awe and wonder due to a love and a passion for the way. All of the talent in the world is not useful to God if we cannot be obedient to him. Hitler was an incredible motivational speaker, very talented. The German command, second to none in their ability to administer, engineer, to get things done. All the talents don't mean anything if we're not obedient. Let's see where talents get us. Let's look back at Ezekiel 28. Ezekiel chapter 28 and verse 12. Ezekiel chapter 28 and verse 12. Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, thus says the eternal God, you had, or were the one, had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and beauty, perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the lapis lazuli, and the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On that day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones and the fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until the righteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, a covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you. Obviously, the description of Satan. Satan was a created being. Before the first destruction of the earth, after God's creation, it was a thing of beauty. It was like what the world tomorrow, when it's established, what it's going to be like. A wonderful place, a beautiful place. And here was a being that was put into that had every talent. He was smart. He was good looking. He was charming. It's a burden that many of us bear. And some of us not. But he had everything. And we see what happened because he did not have that main characteristic, and that is a heart of obedience. How do we develop this heart of obedience? We talked about how important it is and why it's so important. But how do we develop? How do we get this characteristic? Let's look at Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13 and verse 1. Romans 13 and verse 1. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those who exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who oppose will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. But because of this you are also to pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. The concept of obedience and the concept of authority is established by God. It's not established by man. It is established by God. And as Paul wrote in Romans, and as a comparison for your notes, 1 Peter 2, Peter wrote about the same thing. 1 Peter 2, 13 through 25. For the sake of time, we won't go there. Two different apostles stressing the same thing. And that is the act of submission and the act of obedience to authority. And it says here, it's not just authority to God. It's submission to authority, I should say, that God has established. The act of submission is not always an easy state to achieve. Just when as we read in James, if we look at the root of most disagreements in the body of Christ, it revolves around the concept of submitting and submitting to one another. Now, I have a better way. I want to be in charge. And we see where that attitude gets us, even within the body. When we move away the concept of being in obedience or being in submission to one another, we see the division that is caused. However, it is a characteristic that God cannot provide to us. When we think about talents, God can provide talents. But as the church and the scriptures teach, God cannot provide character. He cannot provide holy, righteous character. And we think about the attitude and the heart of obedience, that's character. We think about the heart of service, that's character. And it's not something that God can just magically give to us, but it's something that we need to learn and we need to develop as part of our character. Do we recognize and take the opportunity to practice obedience and obedience to authority? Both here at the feast as well as at home. We're all under authority here at the feast. The usher that's helping to sit, I'm under that authority. The usher says, please don't sit here. I would like for you to sit there. Well, you don't understand. I'm an elder. I had hands laid on me. No, I'm under authority. Each of you are under authority. Mr. McCoy is under authority. He's under authority to the folks who own and run this place. We're all under authority, and we have a chance to practice that obedience, to help out, to be willing to move when we're asked to move, to be willing to make things go more smoothly. But we are under obedience, and we have an opportunity to practice that obedience. Young people, you have the ability to practice that obedience in school. Because you are under authority. You're under authority of your teachers. One of my children, who'll go nameless, I should say, was having an issue getting passing grades on algebra homework. The teacher had a very simple rule. You write your answers in pencil. My son, wanted to write his answers in pen. And he would get so frustrated. It's like, why can I write my answers in pen? It's simple. The rules. You're under obedience. You're under authority. The teacher says write in pencil, so you write in pencil. If the teacher said write in purple crayon, you write in purple crayon. It's a question of, and it may seem like a small thing, but it's a question of learning obedience. And especially where we talked about where the world is going with an attitude towards obedience. I remember seeing a cartoon where you had two panels. The first panel had 1960 under it, and there were parents that were holding a test. It had a big D-, and they were looking with the teacher behind them, looking at the student, doing this. And then you had the next panel was 2000, and I forget the year it was, 2010, and the parents were turned looking at the teacher doing this, with the student in the background looking pretty smug. But that captures the attitude. Before, if someone did something wrong and they were disciplined at school, they were disciplined more harshly when they got home. Now, it's a question of when someone gets in trouble or challenged at school, then the parents are there to sue the school board. We're all under authority. And it's a chance for us to practice that authority. We're under authority at work. We're under authority at church. A heart of obedience is a characteristic that loves God's way. They recognize that we're all in obedience and that we're all in submission, even to one another, as we are in submission to Jesus Christ. In the world tomorrow, God needs those who will not direct people away from Him and His way. That's why a heart of obedience is so important for us. Let's also look at a heart of service. A heart of service. If we take a cursory look at the concept of priesthood, it's all about service. And it's kind of interesting to think about that we're a royal priesthood, that we'll be a part of the kingdom of priests. And I think, wow, a priest. When I was first asked if I would be considered being ordained an elder, my first response was, I'm not sure if I would want to attend a congregation that would have me as an elder. I feel so inadequate. I feel that I am not up to the task. Sitting there, you may think, a priest, me? I'm not adequate. I am not up to that task. But if you look at the concept of priesthood and what it means, it's not about just preaching or doing those things that you might think, will keep you from being a priest. It's all about service. Under the Old Covenant, the priests were responsible for preparing the tabernacle, of offering sacrifices, including at times participating in some of those sacrifices with those that were sacrificing the animal. But both in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, it was about caring for the people of God and teaching His word. That's what a priest does. A priest ministers. Do we have a heart of service? God needs to know that we have a care for others. He needs to know that we have a heart of service. Let's look at Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31. Matthew 25 and verse 1. This section in my version here, the New American Standard, is called the judgment. Verse 31 of Matthew 25. But when the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the angels with Him, and then He will sit on His glorious throne. This time we're celebrating now. All the nations will be gathered before Him, and He will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And He will put the sheep on His right and the goats on the left. Then the King will say to those on His right, Come you, who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. something that we're all praying about, that kingdom come, that we're part of that kingdom. We want to be there. So Jesus Christ says, inherit the kingdom, verse 35. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer and say, Lord, when did you see all these things? When did I see you hungry or thirsty? And when did I see you as a stranger? And when did I clothe you or visited you? In verse 40, the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. Then he'll say to those on the left, depart from me, accursed, into the eternal fire which had been prepared for the devil and the angels. For I was hungry, and you did nothing. For I was thirsty, and you did nothing. I was a stranger, and you did nothing. Where was your heart of service? Where was your heart of care? And it's not written in here, but you could almost maybe imagine them saying, but wait a second. I gave the most incredible sermon in Ocean City. People were moved. They were excited. What are you talking about? Or I did this, or I did that. Do we have a heart for the brethren? Are we moved to do something to help? Are we building a heart of service? What is at the core of why we do what we do? How can we develop that heart of service? God is love, and love is demonstrated outgoing concern for others. That opportunity to build that heart of service can show in many forms. But it requires us to look outward beyond ourselves. How can we? Here at the feast, we can do things that helps us to think about others and to provide a heart of service. Simple things, like you're sitting on the end of the aisle and you have a family that you know they're going to need to get up and get out. Are you going to move to the middle of the aisle? Are you going to hold claim to the God-given right for a guy to sit on the end of the aisle? It's a little thing, but it's showing a heart of service. Are we willing to pitch in and recognize, look for someone who may need to be taken out to dinner, someone who doesn't have as much money, or someone who's just has difficulty getting to know people, or seeing a single parent that has a few kids that are running around and you can see it in their eyes. They're tired. They want to be here. They're happy to be here, but they need some help. Some examples for us to be able to look out and see this heart of service. And we can continue to work on these things when we get home. Being at Sabbath services is important. But it's not about being at Sabbath services. I want to be very careful. It's required. We want to be there. But we're there to give. We're there to help. We're there to serve, to develop that heart of service. It's interesting, the examples that we see in Acts. That church had to rely upon one another. They demonstrated a heart of service. They broke bread together. They fellowshiped together. They supported one another. They gave to one another. And I would hold out as things get worse, as what we reviewed at the beginning of the sermon comes to pass, and we got people knocking on our door saying, how come you're not following this law that says you can't believe this way? Or as these things start to come to pass where food is hard to get, where water is hard to get, The persecution gets much worse. We have to rely upon each other more and more. We have to build those bonds. We have to build that heart of service now so that we are prepared, because it will come. It's prophesied. Are we building that heart of service? One of the greatest opportunities to show a heart of service is to be patient, to allow others to work through their issues. That doesn't mean we give up on our standards, or we say, no, it's okay. God's not going to look. No, our standards are the same. God's way are the same. The truth is the truth. We don't give up on that. But how we treat others and how we be patient with others as they work through those issues. Let's look at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12. So those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. It's like the parable of the rich master in Matthew 18, where the rich servant was forgiven for his debts. But his servants, he was not willing to forgive. God has forgiven us, and God is patient with us. Are we patient with one another? Because that's building that heart of service. That's knowing that someone is struggling. Or we see someone that we don't have a self-righteous attitude like the publican and the tax collector and the Pharisee, I should say. Oh, I'm thankful I'm not. I'm better than that person. I'm glad I'm much more righteous. But a heart of service works to help teach, to say, no, this is God's way. This is why he says what he says. It's a difference of attitude. It's a characteristic. It's something that is developed in us that we need to be working on now. A heart of service, a heart of obedience, and a heart of service is the foundation. It is the foundation. Am I preaching a grace alone doctrine here? Absolutely not. I want to make sure that is very clear. What I'm conveying here, that there is a foundation on which we build these other items. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. First Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 1. Commonly called the love chapter. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 1. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. The gift of prophecy. If I have the gift of prophecy, I have the gift of knowledge. If I have all faith, if they can move mountains, but I don't have love, I have nothing. I can give my possessions. I can surrender my body. But if I don't have love, it profits me nothing. Verse 4, love is patient, love is kind. It is not jealous, love does not brag, and it's not arrogant. It does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, it's not provoked. It does not take into account a wrong suffered. We can continue on and read 1 Corinthians, but let's skip down to verse 13. But now faith, hope, love, abide these three, but the greatest of these is love. Paul, in writing this, is not disparaging the gift of prophecy or the knowledge or faith. Obviously, he's not disparaging any of those. But he's talking about a foundation on which to build those. Because we've already said, we can have the most incredible talents in the world. But if it's not based on a foundation of obedience and a foundation of love or service to others, it's for naught. We're talking priorities here. And a foundation. Jesus Christ modeled these behaviors. And he modeled this focus. Think about it. All of Jesus Christ's direct teachings and his activities. He was always obedient to the Father, to the point of death. He said, I'm not here to do my own will. I'm not here to push across my own way. I'm here to do the will of the Father. It was about obedience. And then a heart of service, to the point of him giving his own life for the love of the brethren and the love of all of mankind. Going to services is very important. Being here at the Feast of Tabernacles is very, very important. Our ability to understand the scriptures and read the scriptures and know where all the 12 tribes went is very important. But I would hold out that they fall under the concept of obedience and love. And how we use those things we know. And how we do, and why we go to services, and why we interact with people, and why we spend time with people, and all those things to be based on a foundation of service. Getting back to the question I asked at the beginning of the sermon, who am I to help God usher in his kingdom? What talents do I have? It's a fair question. But if we work on obedience, and if we work on love, God will give us all the talents we need to do his job. Just like he gave talents to Satan, the morning star, the king of Tyre. Just like he's blessed us now with some talents, but maybe not everything we think we're adequate or would be adequate to be part of the kingdom of priests, to help heal, to help teach, to help those who've gone through the tribulation and say, let me show you a better way. Let me show you a love of God. Let me show what your future is. That we need a heart of obedience and a heart of service.